The first thing they tried to steal wasn't his freedom, it was his name. And that was the one thing he refused to give. The auction block was worn smooth by countless feet that had stood upon it, each pair belonging to someone whose name would soon be forgotten. Kofi felt the wood beneath his bare soles, still cool in the morning air, and fixed his eyes on the distant tree line where the forest met the sky. He would not look at their faces. He would not give them that. "Strong back," the auctioneer was saying, his voice carrying across the crowd like the call of a carrion bird. Young, maybe 17 or 18 years, good teeth, no signs of disease or rebellion. Kofi's jaw tightened at that last word. They did not know. They could not see what lived behind his eyes, the fire his mother had placed there with her stories, the iron his father had forged there with his silence. They saw only flesh and muscle, bone and sinew, a body to be measured and weighed like cotton or tobacco. The bidding began. Numbers floated up from the crowd, abstract and meaningless to Kofi. What did these amounts signify except the price of breaking a world apart? He had been torn from everything he knew 3 months prior, from the village where his name meant born on Friday, where every person who spoke it connected him to his ancestors, to his day of birth, to the very fabric of who he was. Sold to Mr. Edmund Fairweather of Sweetwater Plantation. The crowd dispersed, and Kofi was led down from the block, his wrists bound with rope that had bound others before him. Mr. Edmund Fairweather approached, a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that assessed Kofi the way one might assess a horse. "What's your name, boy?" Fairweather asked. Kofi met his gaze directly. "Kofi." Something flickered across Fairweather's face, surprise perhaps at being looked at so directly. "That's not a Christian name. We'll call you Joseph." "Yes, Joseph. That's a good biblical name." "My name is Kofi." The words hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. The overseer, a thick-necked man called Morrison, stepped forward with a raised hand, but Fairweather held up his own hand to stop him. "Proud, this one," Morrison muttered. "We'll need to break that." "Perhaps," Fairweather said, still watching Kofi with an expression that was difficult to read. "But let's see what work does first. Pride in a man can be useful if properly directed. Take him to the quarters. Put him with the field hands. We'll see how he does with the planting." Sweetwater Plantation sprawled across 300 acres of Virginia soil, its fields thick with tobacco plants that would be tended, harvested, cured, and shipped to distant shores. Kofi was given a small space in one of the wooden cabins that housed the enslaved people who worked the land. His cabin mates regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. An older man named Samuel spoke first. "Heard you made trouble already, 'fore you even started working. That true?" "I told them my name," Kofi said simply. A younger woman, her name was Ruth, laughed without humor. "Your name? And what good did that do you? You think they care what you call yourself?" "I care," Kofi said. Samuel shook his head slowly. "You one of them fresh from across the water. Still got fight in you. That fight gonna get beaten out or it gonna get you killed. Best learn to bend before you break." But Kofi had watched his father work iron back in his village, had seen how the metal had to be strong enough to hold its shape, even as it was heated and hammered. There was a difference between bending and breaking, and he understood that his was the core of who he was, the one thing they had not yet managed to take. The work was brutal. From dawn until long after dusk, Kofi labored in the tobacco fields, his hands blistering and bleeding as he learned to tend the temperamental plants. The sun beat down without mercy, and the overseer's whip cracked whenever Morrison deemed someone's pace too slow or their posture too upright. But each evening, when Fairweather made his rounds to inspect the day's work, he would pause by Kofi. "How are you finding the work, Joseph?" "My name is Kofi, and the work is work." The first week, Fairweather merely raised an eyebrow. The second week, he frowned. The third week, he said, "You are stubborn. Do you know what happens to stubborn slaves?" "I know what happens to men who forget who they are," Kofi replied. It became a ritual, this daily exchange. The other enslaved people watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some thought Kofi was mad. Others began to whisper that perhaps he was brave. Ruth stopped mocking him and started leaving small portions of her own meager food rations outside his sleeping space. Samuel began to tell stories in the evenings, stories he said he'd nearly forgotten, about his own childhood in a place he could barely remember, about a mother who had sung songs in words that English couldn't capture. Morrison, the overseer, grew increasingly frustrated. "Let me take him," he urged Fairweather. "3 days with me, and he'll call himself whatever you like." But Fairweather seemed almost intrigued by Kofi's resistance. "No," he said, "not yet. I want to understand this first." One evening, nearly 2 months after Kofi's arrival, Fairweather did something unprecedented. He asked Kofi to come to the main house, to the library, where floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of books Kofi could not read. "Sit," Fairweather said, gesturing to a chair. Kofi remained standing. Fairweather poured himself a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "I've been thinking about you, Joseph, or Kofi as you insist. You're different from the others. You look at me as if you're my equal, as if you have a right to your defiance." "Every man has a right to his name," Kofi said. "Is that what you believe? That names have power?" Fairweather walked to his bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines. "I studied philosophy at university, read the classics. The Greeks believed that names held the essence of a thing, that to name something was to understand it, to control it." "Then you understand why I will not give mine up." Fairweather turned to face him, and for the first time, Kofi saw something in the man's eyes that might have been respect, or perhaps just a different kind of cruelty. The cruelty of a man who played with his possessions before breaking them. "Your name means nothing here," Fairweather said quietly. "You are property. I own you as surely as I own these books, this house, the land outside. Your name, your past, your very identity. These are luxuries that have been stripped from you. The sooner you accept this, the easier your life will be." "My life will never be easy," Kofi said, "but my name will always be mine." Winter came, and with it a slight reprieve from the relentless field work. The enslaved people of Sweetwater Plantation prepared the land for the next season, repaired tools and buildings, and huddled together against the cold in their poorly heated cabins. It was during this season that Kofi began to teach. In the evenings, by the light of small fires, he would speak to those who would listen about where he came from, about the language his people spoke, about the meaning of names. He taught them the few words he remembered, sounds that felt like home on his tongue. He told them about his mother, who had been a storyteller, and his father, who had been a blacksmith respected throughout their region. We all had names that meant something, he told them. Names that connected us to our families, to our gods, to the very day we were born. They can take our freedom, but they cannot take our stories unless we let them. More and more people began to gather for these evenings, sessions. Ruth brought her own stories, fragments of memories from her childhood, before she'd been sold away from her mother. Samuel remembered songs, words he'd thought were lost forever. A man named Daniel, who worked in the stables, recalled that his grandmother had told him his real name once, though he'd been too young to remember it clearly. It sounded like Kwame, he said hesitantly, or something like it. Born on Saturday, Kofi said, and Daniel's eyes widened with recognition, as if something deep inside him had suddenly awakened. The gatherings grew, and with them came a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the plantation. People began to walk with their heads slightly higher. When Morrison's whip cracked, there was a defiance in some eyes that hadn't been there before. The change was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Fairweather noticed. Of course he noticed. Spring arrived with its demands for planting, and Morrison's cruelty intensified. He seemed to sense the change in the people he was meant to keep subjugated, and it infuriated him. He focused his particular attention on Kofi, looking for any excuse to punish him. One morning, Morrison declared that Kofi had been moving too slowly, that his rows weren't straight enough, that he'd shown disrespect by not lowering his eyes. The overseer ordered him tied to the whipping post in the center of the plantation yard, where everyone could see. "Maybe this will teach you your place, boy," Morrison snarled. "Maybe this will teach you to answer to the name you've been given." Kofi stood with his back exposed to the whip, his hands bound to the post. He could feel the eyes of everyone on the plantation, enslaved and free alike, watching this moment. He thought of his father, who had faced raiders without flinching, who had died protecting his family. He thought of his mother's last words to him before they'd been separated. "Remember who you are." The first lash tore across his back like a line of fire. Kofi gritted his teeth and did not cry out. "What's your name?" Morrison demanded. "Kofi." The second lash came harder than the first. "What's your name?" "Kofi." By the fifth lash, Kofi's vision was starting to blur. By the 10th, his knees had buckled, held up only by the ropes binding his wrists. But each time Morrison demanded his submission, he gave the same answer, his voice growing weaker, but never wavering. "Stop." The command came from Fairweather himself, who had emerged from the main house. Morrison lowered the whip, breathing hard from his exertions. "Mr. Fairweather, sir, the boy needs to learn." "I said stop." Fairweather's voice was cold. He walked to where Kofi hung against the post, looked at the blood running down his back. "Cut him down. Take him to be tended to." As they cut the ropes and Kofi collapsed to his knees, Fairweather crouched down beside him. "You're a fool," he said quietly, so only Kofi could hear. "This kind of pride will get you killed." Kofi lifted his head, met Fairweather's eyes. "Better to die with my name than live without it." Ruth and several others tended to Kofi's wounds that night, applying poultices made from plants they'd gathered in secret, whispering prayers in languages half forgotten. As Kofi drifted in and out of consciousness, Fevered from pain and infection, he dreamed of home, of his village, of his mother's face, of the sound of his name spoken with love and recognition. When he finally woke, 3 days had passed. He was weak, unable to work, and Fairweather had given orders that he was to be allowed to heal before returning to the fields. During this time, something unexpected happened. People began coming to him, one by one or in small groups, when they thought they wouldn't be observed. They told him stories they'd never shared before, memories they'd buried to survive. A woman named Abigail, who worked in the kitchen, told him that her real name was Amma, and that she'd been born on a Saturday, just like Daniel. A young man called Thomas revealed that he remembered his mother calling him Kweku. These names, Kofi said, still weak, but his voice gaining strength. They are who we are. They connect us to something larger than this place, larger than their ownership. When we remember our names, we remember that we are human. The movement spread quietly, carefully, like roots growing deep underground where they couldn't be seen. People began using their true names among themselves, in the privacy of their cabins, in the brief moments when overseers weren't watching. They taught each other the meanings, creating a web of identity that existed beneath the surface of their enslavement. Fairweather observed this transformation with a complex expression. He called Kofi to the library again once he was well enough to walk. "You've started something here," Fairweather said, "something I'm not sure I can control." "You cannot control what is already in people's hearts," Kofi replied. "I could sell you," Fairweather said. "I could send you so far away that no one here would ever hear your name again. I could have you killed." "You could," Kofi agreed, "but the idea would remain, the idea that we are more than what you've made us, that our names, our stories, our humanity cannot be bought or sold or beaten away." Fairweather poured himself a drink, then surprised Kofi by pouring a second glass and handing it to him. "I've been thinking about power," he said, "about what it means to own another human being. I was raised to believe it was natural, ordained by God, and justified by economics. But watching you, listening to the others, I find myself questioning things I never questioned before." Kofi took the glass but didn't drink. "Then perhaps you are more human than you pretend to be." "Perhaps," Fairweather said. "Or perhaps I'm just tired of fighting a battle. I'm beginning to realize I cannot win, not against you, not against what you represent." The seasons turned again, and Kofi's back healed, leaving scars that would mark him forever. He returned to the fields, but he was different now, not broken but tempered, like the iron his father had worked, made stronger through fire and pressure. Morrison was eventually dismissed from his position after a dispute with Fairweather, replaced by a man who was marginally less cruel. The plantation continued its brutal operations, the machinery of slavery grinding on. But within the hearts of many who labored there, something had fundamentally changed. Years passed. Kofi never stopped being Kofi, no matter how many times Fairweather or others called him Joseph. He wore his name like armor, like a declaration of his unbreakable spirit. Others followed his example, reclaiming their identities in whatever ways they could. When Kofi was an old man, having somehow survived decades of a system designed to consume people like kindling, a young woman came to him. She had just arrived at Sweetwater, fresh from the auction block, terror and defiance warring in her eyes. "They say you never changed your name," she said, "that you held on to who you were no matter what they did to you." "It's true," Kofi said, his voice weathered but still strong. "They want to call me Sarah, but my name is Adwoa. I was born on Monday." Kofi smiled, and in that smile was the accumulation of all his years of resistance, all the small victories and terrible losses, all the names remembered and passed down in whispers and stories. "Then you are Adwoa," he said, "and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Your name is yours, and it carries the weight of all who came before you. It is the one thing they can never truly take unless you surrender it. And you, I can see, are not one who surrenders." The young woman straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and Kofi saw in her eyes the same fire that had burned in his all those years ago when he first stood on that auction block and refused to look away. "I am Adwoa," she said, and her voice was clear and certain. "Yes," Kofi said, "yes, you are." And in that moment, in that simple exchange of names and recognition, there was a rebellion more profound than any violence, a resistance more powerful than any weapon. For they had remembered who they were, had claimed their humanity in the face of a system designed to strip it away. And in doing so, they had won a victory that no chain could ever diminish. The name that would not be taken had become a legacy passed from one person to another, a flame kept alive in the darkness, a promise that even in the depths of inhumanity, the human spirit could not be fully conquered. Kofi's name lived on, spoken with reverence by those who understood what it meant to hold on to oneself when the world demanded surrender. And long after he was gone, when the institution that had bound him had finally crumbled, his story was still told. The story of a man who refused to be anyone other than who he was, who taught others that their names, their identities, their very souls were worth fighting for. In the end, they could take his freedom, his labor, his body. But his name remained forever his own. Kofi. Born on Friday, forever free in the one place that mattered most.